What can we do to deal more effectively with the plague of corruption?
The answer to this question is multifaceted, but I think it rests very much on a very basic principle. You need to increase the benefits and increase the costs associated, increase the benefits associated with being honest and increase the costs associated with being corrupt. One aspect of this, obviously, is you need to have adequate levels of compensation for civil servants and government employees. Otherwise, what will happen is that they will try to supplement their income if they cannot make a living on it, by illicit activities. People often mention to the example of Singapore. Singapore is one of the countries that has some of the lowest levels of corruption in the world, has some of the best paid civil servants in the world. And in fact, this is not just anecdotal. There are empirical studies that have been done that actually showed that, in those countries that have the lowest wages, you have the highest levels of corruption and vice versa. So this is clearly one element of the solution. I think press freedoms, are very important. You need to have access to information. You need to publicize the activities of the government. There needs to be a kind of a certain degree of scrutiny of the actions of government, and I think that this is facilitated by the existence of a free press. If you don't have a free press, then of course the opportunities for things being done in the dark, on the sidelines, in an illicit way are enhanced. An active civil society and a political opposition also matters, I think. Governments are less likely to be corrupt if they know that there's a vigilant, active civil society that is going to be, basically, examining and scrutinizing their activities. Better business regulation, of course, helps. If you have sensible rules that encourage less complex and less costly procedures, that strengthen the quality of institutions, for instance, if we have courts that are much better at enforcing contracts in a society, these things are going to have a favorable impact in terms of reducing corruption. I've already mentioned the subject of subsidies. I think that subsidies are a misallocation of resources. They create perverse incentives. In many parts of the world, they lead to smuggling, because I could give you examples of countries where, let's say, gas or petroleum products are heavily subsidized, and they are not in the country neighboring, and then there is active trade, where basically you buy it at the subsidized price domestically, and you take it across the border to sell it, and then in the next country at a higher price. This activity doesn't really contribute to economic growth. It's just a kind of a reallocation of rents, and unfortunately, it puts the state at the center of basically encouraging corruption and smuggling. When in fact it shouldn't be doing these things. You want to safeguard the credibility of the state. You don't want to undermine its credibility. I think that a better budget process helps. Budgets are formulated once a year. I think that if the targets are well known, if the policies underpinning the operations of the budget are made public, if there is a debate about the virtues of the budget and the costs that are associated with implementation of the budget for different groups in society, this is fine, because in the end, the budget is one of the largest pocket of resources in the economy, and this is something that takes place once a year. So transparency and clarity is very important. Paul Collier, in that excellent book of his, The Bottom Billion, gives a couple of examples. In Chad, the government was basically allocating some resources for public health clinics. And they did some surveys to establish that 99% of the resources never made it to the public health clinics. They were lost along the way. They looked at the data in Uganda, for allocations to primary schools, and there 80% of the resources never made it to the primary schools. They were basically, sort of ransomed along the way by people that had nothing to do with primary education. However, and this is the nice end of the story, the government at some point decided that they were going to publicize these budget allocations, in the media, and they were going to inform directly to the primary schools, this is how much money we're sending you. compliance rates increased, from 20% to 90%, because all of a sudden, in the context of transparency and openness, the corrupt officials were far more careful because they were going to be found out. International conventions are very, very important. I already mentioned, the anti-bribery convention that was signed by the OECD. However, in December of 2005, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption was entered into force. This was ratified by the vast majority of the countries that had signed it. And it's a very powerful instrument, at least conceptually. It deals with corruption in developing countries and in developed countries. It deals with corruption in the state sector and in the private sector. It looks at issues of conflict of interest. There are provisions for the recovery of stolen assets and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, as you know, the United Nations does not have enforcement mechanisms, right? And therefore, the effectiveness of the convention to help us fight against corruption is going to ultimately depend on the willingness of governments, to implement monitoring mechanisms and to basically hold their businesses, especially, accountable before the convention. No? Finally, the other thing that I'd like to say is that especially in the case of the OECD, we have had already for some years this anti-bribery convention. Unfortunately, sometimes countries, because they're always interested in to trade, look the other way when some of their businesses are actually still engaging in bribery of foreign officials, to get contracts, to get concessions, and so on. And I think this is regrettable. There is a certain tension between the need to boost business on the one hand and the need, to reduce corruption on the other. And I think that in this case, we simply just should remind governments that they have entered into some commitments in the context of the UN Convention. There is still, unfortunately, a culture which I think needs to change, that it is okay to bribe officials in small developing countries as part of the cost of doing business. If you are a big corporation, somewhere in the OECD, of course, God forbid, we're not going to bribe officials in our own country, right? Because we know that we're going to feel the full force of the law then. But it's all right to do it in Africa and in other parts of the world. And this is unfortunate, and it's a culture that needs to change very, very quickly. And Cristina, finally, perhaps the other item that comes to mind is the role of technology. Technology, I think, is a very, very promising tool, for reducing corruption. We already see this, for instance, in the way that online tax payments have dramatically reduced the number of interactions that are necessary face-to-face between the taxpayer and the tax inspector. Chile has been fantastically successful, for instance, in introducing a system of public procurement, which in many different parts of the world, public procurement has traditionally been a source of illicit gains and corruption, by establishing an online platform that every person in Chile who wants to sell anything to the state, whether it's a good or a service, has to use. It's fully transparent, has essentially eliminated corruption from the public procurement regime. It doesn't mean that there are not other sources of corruption in the country or any other country, but to the extent that you can use technology, to eliminate, the opportunities for corruption, you are actually making a tangible contribution in this struggle.